In 2011, a small, softly spoken tidying consultant quietly launched a revolution. Marie Kondo didn't storm the parliament or draft a manifesto in blood and ink, but she asked us whether our socks sparked joy. 15 years on, decluttering has become a global ritual, a moral language, almost a belief system about who we are and what we deserve to carry. But what happens when the stuff in question isn't ours? Because long before Netflix sorting montages and color coded storage boxes, there was another fad going on. The late 18th and early 19th centuries, when objects began to define identity in entirely new ways. Industrialization expanded wealth beyond the landed elite. Auctions grew louder, cabinets filled up, drawing rooms became theaters of taste, and collecting wasn't just a hobby. It was proof you had arrived. It was proof that you had status. Modern capitalism didn't only change how people worked, it changed what they owned, what they displayed, and eventually what they passed on. But when the moment comes that no one wants to put up on Instagram is around inheritance, when somebody close to you passes away, when objects, i.e., their objects, stop being about decorations and what's in their house and furnishings, and they start to have real emotional and memory ties. When things like sideboards become sibling disputes, when a painting that might have been there from your childhood is both a memory but also an asset, and when grief is measured in how many cardboard boxes you have. Consumer psychologists argue that we are what we have and that inherited possessions intensify that because they combine our own identities with the deceased person's identity. So today I'm joined by Clarissa Levi, inheritance tax lawyer and former Sotheby specialist, who brings a rare double vision to this conversation. She's seen the auction room and the probate paperwork. She understands the emotional weight of a teacup and the market value of a masterpiece. Together, we're asking, why do we collect? What are we really buying when we buy valuable, quote unquote, things? And what happens when those things move, sometimes painfully, from one generation to another? This is history for fuck's sake, at its most emotionally loaded, culturally sharp, and generally ruthless about what we keep and why. Clarissa, welcome to History for Fuck's Sake. Tell us your story.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Ruthless, cutthroat. I am none of those things. Um, but what I am is a lawyer, and I started, as you said, as I started as a private client lawyer when I trained many years ago, and after not very long in practice, working with people's wills and trusts, I moved to the commercial art world, and as you said, worked at Sotheby's for the majority of that time, 15 years, and from there have moved back into the law, and I'm now working with the art law team of Wedlake Bell, and so it's kind of an arc. My career is
Mm.
it's around people's inheritance and people's collections, and that is precisely what all of the threads of my career bring together.
It's amazing. How do you feel like that affects you as a person doing that? That sort of you've been through your own personal experiences and much like me have had to sort the various things that come with being a child and then being an adult and inheriting those things. What has that sort of career arc meant for you? Has it had a
Yeah.
personal impact on your thinking about collecting?
I would actually say, I would put it a different way. I'd say, what has my personal story brought to my career? Because I think that, well, it's all about what our personal experience has been. That's all we can really bring. And actually, we were talking before this podcast about the reading that I've been doing. I read a weighty academic term about collecting, which is availing me nothing because it's not actually telling me the answers to anything. Because what the answers that I find most interesting come from my own experience. And in the same way, in answer to your question, I think that it's my life experience that really informs what I'm able to give to clients and how I'm able to advise them. So I've experienced loss And and so in my teens, I lost my mother, and in my 20s, I lost my father. And I have seen a lot of grief and loss around me over the course of my life. And yeah, it has taught me quite a lot about how people value possessions. And of course, then feeding into my career, particularly at Sotheby's, in fact, where I was advising collectors on inheritance tax, sort of, how to save objects of importance for the nation. Um, and it's been fascinating seeing how objects come to be valuable to people and the reasons why. And it's often got nothing to do with money at all.
Mm. It's I too have experienced loss when I was quite young. I've mentioned on previous podcasts that I lost my grandmother um, to suicide, and it took me quite a long time, that she didn't have a lot of possessions to share on, although I have a number of small things. But as I have gotten older, what I have, fortunately realized that, my memory of her hasn't been sort of trapped in me holding on to those possessions, and that it has allowed me to sort of take a step back and go, actually, my memory is my memory, and it doesn't have to be to coincide with that. Now, I'm not yet having gone through the tragedy of losing my parents, um, and what I do have is dealing with my mother's hoarding. I know you're listening, Mom, so we're going to talk about this again at some point. Um, but I do know what it's like to kind of be looking at, oh wow, like we all have so much stuff. And it's a very Western, it's consumerist, it's extractive. We all know why. I mean, I think some of us probably know a little bit more why about the sort of the psychology of it. And I think that's what's a really interesting historical link to the time period that we're talking about, which is actually it's a connection, stuff as status and stuff as identity of who we are, and actually this very complex sort of human psychology around, in certain societies, not all societies, obviously, and that actually we are what we have. Um, and I, I, I think that's one of the greatest sort of philosophical questions, in honesty, in our time. Where people are talking about metamodernism, people are talking about post-capitalism. What does this look like? And what we are seeing is, as I mentioned this earlier, is we're the children of baby boomers who collected themselves because oftentimes, certainly my mom and I have talked about this, because their own early life experiences were those of adversity, in a post Second World War, you know, global experience. People didn't have stuff. My mother is British. She grew up with rationing, and in so many ways it makes so much sense that as we sort of got into 20th century industrialization in the post Second World War global economy, it was the creation of stuff. It was the huge advancement of the American, consumerist machine that made people want to have this so-called lifestyle. What, of course, nobody ever predicted is that the accoutrement of that lifestyle actually can create huge amounts of anxiety, both in the people collecting it themselves and the people who are having to deal with those collections. I mean, I'm going to deal with my mom's Tupperware collection is, the extent of what I have to deal with. She doesn't know this, but she's going to find out that every time before they moved house, about 3 years ago, in her kitchen, she used to, she had this collection. I don't think it was on purpose collection of plastic mugs, the travel mugs. And every time I'd come home, I'd throw one out, and she never caught me. So I think I'm going to get yelled at after this podcast goes live. But yeah, you never caught me, Mum. So we can talk about that as well. Anyway, Clarissa, thank you for joining, and let's talk a little bit about this 15-year anniversary of Marie Kondo. Why do you think? And by the way, so Marie Kondo's book came out in Japan in 2011, and it became a Netflix series and a book that sort of went more widely global in 2014. So we're talking about the 2011 sort of a book coming out. Why do you think she was so popular? What is it that really kind of connected people to that? It became such a craze, and then you've got Swedish death cleaning. You've got people who just absolutely find it so cathartic, and then you've got people like me. I'd rather poke my eye out with a stick than do this, even though I know the huge irony of me talking about my poor mom and me having to chat with her and help her and whatnot. She is so going to kill me after this episode, by the way.
That's gonna
So yeah,
that's gonna
Mary
be
Kondo.
interesting.
Yeah, why was she so popular in your opinion?
Well, because we need this. I mean, it's all about the shadow side of collecting and the shadow side of the immense good fortune that we have of being able to accumulate possessions. Things have become more within our reach, objects have become more available to us. People have got more resources to collect stuff. And so we're doing it more and more. And as you say, that comes with it, that, we pay a price for that. It's not just all positive and upside and bringing us safety and comfort. It definitely creates not just anxiety, but a kind of real burden. And I see this in collectors that I work with, but actually I've also observed it in life, and in my own life, where I've lived with at various times in my life, I've lived with uh, an inability to not myself, but my parents when I was little a bit, and then later in life similarly, where stuff, there was sort of no ability to get rid of it. And that's not the same as collecting on purpose. That is just a kind of it's yeah, it's when stuff becomes a real burden and we feel like we have to keep it just in case it might be useful one day or, for whatever other reason. And sometimes we just need permission to say goodbye to those piles of things, um, because otherwise they can control us. And it's actually the opposite of what we want them for. We want to make sense of this world, and I think that's why we do collect things. So when the things start being more in control of us, that's where there's a big problem, and that is where we need someone to come in and say, no, you can let go.
I think it's a really interesting discussion point about where you let things go to. So, one of the things people will talk about is someone might say, just take it to the dump. Well, it's like, well, landfill, and it can't just go to the, oh, we'll take it in Canada's case, take it to the Goodwill, or take it to a secondhand charity shop. And there's almost an element of not wanting to let go sometimes because you don't want to let go of its potential utility
Mm,
as well. It's like, this could be useful. Okay, maybe it's not going to be useful for me, but it could be useful for somebody else.
yeah,
And I do wonder whether, generationally, whether we actually think about utility and the reusability of things in the
yeah.
same way that actually I think you see a lot more of in younger generations now,
Mm,
because I mean, you've got things like one of my previous podcast guests, Louisa, she's a vintage fashion sort of maven. And, there's a huge amount of, because of hyper awareness around the environment, fast fashion, that kind of stuff, there seems to be a much more growing interest in actually, if there's going to be stuff, it doesn't have to necessarily be new stuff.
mm, yeah,
And yet, at the same time, we also face the fact that we have a lot of baby boomers who have furniture and other things that none of us seem to want to take, and like they go into charity shops and nobody wants to take on because they're not fashionable or they're just not right, and there's a funny old dichotomy going on there, isn't there?
Well, I completely agree that it makes a big difference where things go to. It makes it much easier to let go of things if you know that you're not doing harm with them. Like sending things to landfill hurts. It hurts.
Mm.
Um, but that's why it's so clever. There's this company that I've got a big problem with books. I inherited a lot of books, and I gave as many as I possibly could away when my dad died. But I was still left with far too many books, more books than I can really cope with. And so there is this company that will buy your books from you. And it's sort of, 10p, it might buy your book for 10p or 15p or something like that. And that is so clever because it's not actually about the money, but it's about it is the thing that enables me to let go of my father's precious books because I know that the fact that I'm being paid even 10p for them means that someone cares enough to pick them up and perhaps resell them, hopefully at a profit for them. And just kind of keeps the books in life. Makes it, it sort of absolves me. I'm not throwing it out, so I'm sort of not dishonoring my father's, because he cared a lot about those books, and that is where the burden comes from. Because I know he cared about them, I have to be very careful about how I treat them because I don't want to dishonor him, or, you know, I want to respect his memory.
Books is a really interesting one. I've got a friend who, you know, just doesn't like having books around. Is a voracious reader on her Kindle and things like that, but the books are a burden. Whereas I'm like you, I love having books around. I find it incredibly difficult to not just get rid of books, but to stop buying physical books because I'm like, I will read this. This is amazing. I'm so interested. And it's like I would need 10 lifetimes to actually read all of these books. But you and I have also talked about little things such as our instinct to prep as well and to nest. And I think in one of my previous pods we talked about digitization of books. But okay, what happens if energy runs out and we can't keep our digital infrastructure going? Well, books are knowledge. Books are history. It's all history for sake, as I said, and it's there written on paper. Um, and so yeah, I think there's so much complexity to the story and relationship we have to books and our not just our family knowledge and honoring the past, but our kind of human knowledge as well, and sort of
Yeah.
thinking about the future. So, what do you think, out of curiosity, when you see people buying things as collectibles, so not just buying things for the sake of buying things because they're getting a dopamine kick out of it, or it's useful. They're buying things as collectibles. My husband is a collector. We have a little barn that I don't go into at the moment because it's so full of his collections that I just like, nope, that whole building doesn't exist in my life anymore. So what do you see when people do that from your experience at Sotheby's? What is it that people are doing?
Well, it's a really interesting one because, I mean, my instinct when you ask that question is to assume that you're talking about people who collect stuff for value because they hope that it's going to
Mm,
increase in value and then they'll
mm,
sell it. And that's really simple, that example. But it's actually never really about that. People don't collect. I mean, if they did, it would be a hiding to nothing.
mm,
So one example from my career is that, every so often somebody will approach me to say, can I help with recommending works of art to go into a pool of works of art that will basically become an investment for people. And I never ever get involved with that kind of thing because I tend to think that with art in particular, but you can say it about anything. Um, if you're collecting it just for money, just so that you hope it, because you hope it will increase in value, that's a sort of terrible reason for collecting it. Because it's not, you can't count on it. You have to, in my view, view a collection of whatever object it is that you love as a joy. And if you look at it as just a pleasure, then any increase in value is a bonus, and that is how it has to be, because otherwise you're just going to be disappointed. in the long run, or probably because not everything can always behave the way you want it to financially, and that's just kind of no way to live really. In
Mm.
my like, fine, we've all got to make money and work for a living. I mean, of course, but when it comes to collecting objects which are luxuries or for beauty or for pleasure, then I really have to remain focused on the fact that they're just optional. And and so I don't think it is ever really, I think it's very, very rarely about money. I think people actually tend to agree with that, and they tend to stick to objects that mean something to them for whatever reason. And that is always different. And this is a bit controversial, but I do think as well that objects are fairly interchangeable. Somebody can become obsessed with stamps, but the same person in a different life would be just as obsessed with Victorian paintings. And actually, it doesn't make any difference in terms of the pleasure that those things give me as the collector. I'm going to say I don't think it matters what I collect. I may now get
It's
fired from all
it
my jobs.
it's the act of collecting. It's the act of creating things and filling gaps and, creating these sort of almost like mosaics of similar items, and sort of how do you do that. And my husband and I have talked about that quite extensively. He's got a friend, in fact, it's Louisa Rogers' father, who will be listening to this episode as well. And the enjoyment of collecting, of finding, it's an act of joy. I suppose it's like Marie Kondo asks everybody in the book, like, does this
Does it
thing
spark joy?
spark joy?
But it's not always just about joy. I mean, I do think that there's definitely a point in many collectors' journey where it stops being about joy and it starts just being about obsession. And it can become very addictive, so that, you can't really rest until you found the thing that you are looking for that will just, and every next thing is the one thing that you can't really rest until you've found it and it's plugged that gap in your collection. But then the second you have, you're on to the next one. And that's not about sparking joy, is it? That, that's something different. That's about a lack, a scarcity. And that's another sort of side of collecting, is really just about it's about providing for ourselves and keeping ourselves safe somehow.
There's a neuroscience to it. There's a chemical, you know, dopamine response to collecting, if that's what you're into. And I think you see that on a wide spectrum of people, between the, as you said, the sparking joy to the, this is getting more and more compulsive as
Mm.
a thing. Let's go back to the late 18th century, early 19th century for a minute, because one of the things that I have always been very conscious of as the eldest daughter is kind of the emotional labor that comes with inheriting things, and, you know, what you have to do when you have inherited things. So, and I'm very blessed with a husband who's incredibly good at actually sorting out houses. So, I'm Frank is a delight when it comes to this. Has helped me out on a number of occasions with families and stuff like that. But it's typically, and I think back to sort of Sense and Sensibility, to Jane Austen, that women, because of the law at the time around inheritance, often inherited more movable items. They became the inheritors of more emotional things rather than of land or buildings or things that had traditional asset value. And do you see that still, that gender bias in sort of the inheritance of things, out of
Oh yeah.
curiosity?
I mean, absolutely. The law has changed a bit, but not much. And in the end, so it comes down to this. If you want a collection, or I mean, we're not talking about land or buildings, but if you want a kind of heritage collection, which normally does include a house and land, to stay together, then you can't divide it. You can't split it up amongst all of your children and then all of their children and so on. Or what you get is no collections anymore, obviously. So if you want to protect your heritage, and this is the fundamental part of my career is helping people to find brilliant and satisfying ways of protecting heritage. Um, if you want to do that, then you have to kind of pick an inheritor. And so not everyone is going to be able to benefit from, you can only have one kid that inherits the house. Otherwise, the house has to be sold. As we
Mm,
see in countries, I mean, take France, for example, where all the children have to benefit. What that means is that things do have to be sold. And that's just a different way of doing it. So in this country, do I still see that there's a kind of unfairness between girls and boys? Well, of course there is. Um, it's not always kind of black and white like that, but it's just a simple fact that you can't treat everyone fairly in terms of value if you are also trying to keep the family wealth in one place.
mm. Now, at the time period that we're talking about, it's the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. It is starting to come into the height of sort of early modern capitalism, as well, sort of moving from the sort of Renaissance and period through into the Enlightenment and then the mechanization of industry. And what was happening at that point is, the whole structure of how people made money, and worked and had jobs. The class system changed. The starting from mercantilism through to, professionalizations, unionizations. People fundamentally ended up having, because of social reform as well, ended up having more disposable income, largely. And these are huge generalizations, obviously. But the opportunity to acquire things, wealth with a lowercase w, actually moved away from just being something of sort of landed gentry, wider landowners. It became something where value started to be placed into things, into collections. The value of paintings, the value of art, the value of collectibles, vases, the value of things that have been extracted and dispossessed from the original owners of those things from around the world. Huge issue within our sort of modern heritage and museum movement. What would you say has been the impact of that? Do you think that the, because it's not that long ago, you think about it in the grand scheme of things, we're talking 250, 200, 150 years ago. And this, this whole kind of democratization of things,
More stuff.
I think, yeah, I think is fundamentally created a large part of the society and the day-to-day lives that we live today.
Of
What are
course it
your
has.
thoughts?
Well, I think that I always think of it in these terms. It's always about, f- I'm always struck by the same thing, which is that the more stuff we have, it cuts both ways. The more burden we have. And I'm not one of those people that lives in a minimalist way, not at all. Um, and I enjoy the comfort of things, but I do feel that, and going back to your previous question, if you are in the position of inheriting the things that carry memory for the family or for your ancestors, if you're the one that inherits all of the photo albums or whatever it is, the portraits, um, it is a responsibility as much as much of as much as it is a benefit. And I'm sometimes reminded, I'll tell a cheeky little story about when I started work at Sotheby's, and I went along to an organization which will remain nameless, but it really opened my eyes to this point. Um, it was basically a big gathering of people who were going to inherit an estate, like a big house and some land, probably a farm. Um, and it was almost like a kind of self-help group. It was a kind of sharing knowledge, sharing resources, um, just sharing t tips about how on earth to cope with this situation of being the one that had the responsibility of taking on, and it is a huge responsibility because you don't want to be the child or the generation that makes a failure, if you want to put it that way, or has to sell um, a, a house or some property that has been in the family for X number of generations. So it's a huge and it's a hugely life-changing thing because, when the time comes when you do inherit, you are going to have to just give up your life and go and run that thing. So, I remember just being absolutely aghast in this room, this very grand room in a very grand old house, full of very, very privileged people who were all going to inherit. And I remember thinking, oh my God, if you let a journalist in here, they'd have an absolute field day with the kind of, you know, that hand wringing that's going on, uh, i- i- you know, f among people who are so, so privileged. But I quickly saw that actually it was a really valuable thing. It was a really useful thing because, of course, it is a tremendous responsibility. And you do need to have a bit of a self-help group. You do need to be able to talk to your peers about how on earth to make a go of that. So I would say, yeah, it's this thing that keeps coming back to me about it being a real burden and a real responsibility to inherit things that carry memory.
It's so from my background, I come from you know, this my most recent generation, a middle class background, but my parents' generation is, it's working class background. And, I talked with a friend and sort of connection to the wider family in my previous series about family histories, DNA, the stories that you get told. And from a perspective of somebody who, for those people who did not have over time might have been illiterate, did not have access to books, to documentation. We don't have this, didn't have the same kind of, family history and connection to our ancestors that perhaps people, who are more privileged, but are still at the end of the day human beings. Actually, when you tell me that story, I have empathy for that because
Yes.
if you imagine if, you're going into a national trust property as an example, or going into a historic house and you're seeing paintings on the wall, portraits of people that fundamentally as a visitor, you're going, geez, they look a little bit weird. But actually these are people's grandparents, great grandparents, great great grandparents. They actually have, it's like if we had a miniature portrait or a photo of taken in the 1910s of our great great grandparents, and and had that put on a wall. Who's to say it's not more important? It's still a human connection. It's still your biological history there on the wall. So I don't think any of us can actually sit in judgment about how people can feel about their families. We can all sit in judgment of each other about what we do in our actions as human beings.
Yes.
That's entirely different. But I do think, I have a lot of empathy for that because
Well
you're
said.
quite right in saying it's a big responsibility
It's
for,
such a heavy
you
weight to carry.
it is. And you can't take it to the dump like the rest of us can.
Well, quite. That's it.
you know?
That's why it's so life-changing.
Yeah,
And it's,
absolutely.
the grander and more historic the inheritance, the more of a weight it carries. And I mean, absolutely, it's a it's a hell of a thing to inherit, let's say.
Mm. I One of my favorite films is, and it's 30 years old this year, is the Sense and Sensibility with Emma Thompson and Hugh Grant and Alan Rickman, and I love that, and Kate Winslet, obviously, they're all national treasures. Um, and I mentioned earlier we talked about Austen uses inheritance, particularly female inheritance, as a plot device. I'm curious to know, and you mentioned this earlier about, the law has changed, but not that much. Can you tell me a little bit more about how inheritance law has changed or not changed since sort of the last 200 years? I'm just almost like a little potted history for people.
Well, I won't go into it, actually talking about law is pretty dry, but what else? So there's been clear societal change, obviously, in that it used to be the case, broadly speaking, that your firstborn male, in this country at least, was assumed to be the one that was going to inherit and would inherit whatever it was you had in terms of a house or whatever.
The
Um,
rule of primogenitor, is that?
Correct,
Yeah.
exactly.
Rule. Yeah.
Whereas as a girl, you were expected to go and make your way in life by marrying into someone else's stuff. And that was how we all were going to make a living. Boys inherit stuff, or and girls marry it. And obviously, that has checked. Societally, that has completely changed. So now, what happens is, you get to choose which of your children are going to be, and it can be a girl, it can be a boy. It doesn't have to be the firstborn. It can be the one who is most temperamentally suited to farming or whatever it happens to be. But when I said it hasn't changed that much, what I really mean is I wasn't talking about law. I almost never am. Um, I was talking about just the fundamental kind of rules that apply to, what are you going to do with your family property? You can't split it up. If you do split it up, then it's not going to be able to stay together. I mean, no, you can split it up, but if you do, then it's going to go. It's going to depart your family. If you want to protect it, and if you want to, respect it as heritage and keep it for future generations, then you can obviously not divide it in that way. You have to pick. I said this earlier. You have to pick one child. So that is what I mean when I say, things haven't changed that much.
Case in point, The Gentleman on Netflix. Have you seen that series yet?
I'm a lawyer. I don't get time for TV.
Well, I highly recommend that one. That was quite funny. Um, so, what would you say is some of the biggest myths that people might have around
Yeah.
inheritance and sort of quote unquote family treasures? What are the things that you'd love to dispel?
Oh, well, this is a really easy one. Um, the biggest myth is that inheriting stuff, inheriting things of value, of monetary value, kind of is the same as being shown how loved you are or how important you are. That is, taking any kind of sense of self or self-worth from that is it's a really sad thing in my view. And it's also kind of wrong. Because it's not, well, I mean, without going into it in too much, I'll tell you a little story about my view of stuff generally and the weight of family possessions. Um, was was when my mother died, I was 18, and the day after her funeral, I was at university at the time, and I went back to university, and I was given her gold watch, and her gold watch had been a present from her dad on her 21st birthday, and it was engraved with her initials and the date of her 21st birthday. And I'd had the clasp that week while I'd been at home, the week preceding her funeral. I'd been given this watch and I'd taken it to a jeweler and had the clasp fixed so that it was safe. Anyway, I get to university and I go for a walk that evening. And when I get back to my place, my place where I slept, um, it was gone. And so I lost the watch on the very, very first occasion of wearing it. And I just couldn't believe it. Like, I mean, I kind of fell apart. I just could not believe that I had done this and that my responsibility had proved me to be completely kind of not up to it. And I suppose it was like a self-defense. It was a sort of way of not completely falling into the abyss. I just had to think, this isn't actually a reflection on me, and it is just stuff. And I haven't lost my mother again. And it's not her. It's just a thing. And that thing doesn't really matter. And so that has informed ever after my understanding of property. It's not, when I inherit something, it's not the same as my actual parent. And and if my sibling inherits something that is worth more than what I'm inheriting in terms of money, that doesn't mean that they are more loved. That is just no way. I've only got one shot at life. It's the same question you always have to ask yourself. I'm here for a very, very short time on this planet, and I've got one way to live. And do I want to live thinking in those terms, thinking I am less loved because I didn't get the farm, or or I am a worthless human being because I lost my mother's gold watch. No, that's I cannot see things that way. So I have to take a different view. And I would say that the myth I would like to dispel, because I mean, it absolutely holds true for everyone. The myth I would like to dispel is that stuff that you inherit equals how loved you are.
Absolutely. And how much more can you express that between, there is a gold watch that was your mother's, or 20 odd years later, 30 odd years later, we're not going to talk about our age, Clarissa. You're telling that story. Your mother is being shared with other people. My grandmother is being shared with other people. That in perpetuity, we are talking about our loved ones outwardly, and, some while still alive, some after their death. That is the important thing. That is the legacy that it leaves. The rest are just symbols. But ultimately, it's in our inside ourselves, and the stories that we continue to tell about them.
You
That
said it, it's
is,
inside ourselves.
mm, absolutely. So, if you were to have to give guidance to people so they aren't kind of left with chaos, what
Mm.
would be kind of the gentlest ways that you would advise people to
Ah,
how do they deal with their own history and inheritance and collections and stuff?
Sarah, I would not be gentle.
Oh, really?
I would be
Here we go. Yeah.
brutal.
Okay.
If I was really allowed to behave how I wanted to behave, I would be quite forthright about this. Um, what advice would I give? Number one, make a will. Lots of people don't. Number two, your think about who you're actually leaving. And if you love them even a tiny bit, don't set traps for them. Some people actually do that. Some people set up like traps for after they've died. Anyway, without going into all of that, be kind. Just think about it from their perspective. What is it going to be like for them trying to make head or tail of the situation of your death? And make it as easy for them as you can. So number one, make a will. Number two, make it all as easy as you can. That means having really brave and difficult conversations with your kids or with your heirs before you die. Explain to them what you're doing and why. And especially if it's going to be a bit of a shock to them, or, you know, a lot of people don't have conversations that they know are going to be difficult, because they're going to be difficult. And I think that is the opposite of loving. If you love your family, then have those really difficult conversations at a time when you're there to explain it to them and to show them that, you know, the worst conclusion isn't necessarily the correct conclusion. The other piece of advice I would give is be very careful about what you're be very careful about what you're leaving. Like, it can be immensely touching being the person who has the honor and privilege of going through a dead person's things. Um, seeing intimately into their lives is incredibly special, and it'll happen to most of us at some point. But as the person who is, trying to sort things out for after their death, be very careful about what you're leaving. And what I mean by that is, diaries. Do you want your children to read your diaries? Do you want your children to read your letters? Um, that is it's a really important question because I was having a conversation with my cousin this week, and we were both saying that there were things that we stumbled across whilst going through our our going through things that had been left to us that were like burned on our retinas and we can never unsee, written things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this will be there's something that will be with me until until I die.
Mm,
I wish I'd never read it. I wish I hadn't. It wasn't my business. I shouldn't know it.
mm,
Um, yeah, be careful about that stuff. And I'm saying this because it applies to me. I've got to do all these things as well. I've
mm.
got to make sure that I leave things in as kind a way as I can for my kids. But sometimes,
Yeah.
we can't, there's a limit to what we can do, and we might be surprised by, we don't know when we're going to die and all of that. But yeah.
Absolutely. And as someone who I've been going through writing my will and this year, and and all the various complications that go with that. It's, my God, everybody, sort your shit out, because somebody is going to have to go through it. So just think about who those somebodies are,
Yes.
because it isn't it's funny. So many people just don't want to deal with the whole concept of our own existence,
Mm.
that they don't want to consider that, tragedy can strike at any time. And, what you've left is what you've left.
And
And
it's never
it's,
so shameful that you can't, like, I've been in the situation of, I did this for my father with my sister. I went through his desk and through all of his papers and through, and I also, I've also seen it. It's part of my work. I've seen it for dukes and, you know, goodness knows, all kinds of people. And it's always the same. Whether you're a duke or whether you are a impecunious academic, um, the stuff that you're leaving behind is exactly the same. And we're all in the same position, and we just all need to, as you say, sort our shit out.
yeah,
Thank you.
time only goes one way.
Yeah.
So at the end of all of this, what does it all mean? For me, it comes back to the sort of why I do this podcast. Is it's the grand equalizing of us all, that we are human beings. This is all history, for fuck's sake. It is all exactly the same. And we all face the same joys and traumas and experiences. And if we were just a bit more open about that with ourselves, I think we would have much happier lives. And when I started thinking about doing this episode with you, I remember buying Marie Kondo's book because I thought, oh my God, I am such a mess. I can't keep on top. I'm a maximalist by nature. I found out last year I have ADHD. Lots of ADHDers are maximalists as well. And we're creatives and we love things and color, and it's hard because even I will get overwhelmed with the things. Um, and so when I started thinking about this episode, sort of researching. And do you know what's really funny? Is that 15 years later, Marie Kondo has been interviewed about her methods, the KonMari method, and sparking joy, etc. And it's beautiful because this was in like the New York Times a couple of years ago. But she said, I'm 38 years old with a family now, and I cannot keep on top of the stuff. And she goes, it's anxiety inducing, yes, but even I can't do it. So, you know, the everyday tedium of stuff, even weighs Marie Kondo down. And, for generations, we've been collecting and keeping and treasuring things in our cupboards, our attics, in a, eventually in the probate paperwork, in it's all there, and it's all our detritus of our lives. So I wanted to leave this episode with just one sort of question for our listeners, which is, what story do you want your stuff to tell, and to whom? So on that note, Clarissa, thank you for
Ooh,
joining. And
thank you.
everybody, thank you for listening to History for Fuck's Sake. Go and sort your shit out. And before we go, thank you to our sponsor, the Tricola Collective. Tricola is a heritage development consultancy helping cultural projects unlock funding, build sustainable futures, and turn bold ideas into lasting impact. If you need expert support for a heritage or cultural project, they're the people to speak to. Find out more in the show notes.